Hello, class, and welcome to Hedonism, Cynicism, and Stoicism, Greek and Roman perspectives on the good life. So as usual, we're going to do a brief overview, and then we'll jump right into a discussion of hedonism, cynicism, and stoicism, and then we'll end with a concluding question. So in the first millennia CE, there were three major philosophical schools of thought in the Roman Empire: hedonism, cynicism, and stoicism. And during this period, itinerant philosophers from these schools would travel throughout the Roman Empire, teaching their views on the proper human life. And although these schools of thought became popular in Rome, they all have Greek origins, and they all, interestingly enough, claim Socrates as their patron saint. Now, with this in mind, what is hedonism? So hedonism refers to any philosophical school that believes that the good life consists of maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain. And similar to Aristotle, hedonists argue that their teachings on the good life are grounded in natural law. So for hedonists, all living beings seek pleasure or positive feelings and avoid pain or negative feelings. This is a fact of nature, whether you're talking about trees or whether you're talking about groundhogs or human beings. So the most natural life for living beings for hedonists is one dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure. Now there are two different types of hedonism: CYRENAIC hedonism and Epicureanism. So let's start with the first. So CYRENAIC hedonism, as argued by the Greek philosopher Aristippus, argues that the good life is defined by the pursuit of intense sensory pleasure. And this is because feelings of intense pleasure really make us feel alive. So if we wish to truly live, then a good life is one where we experience intense forms of pleasure. So for example, where would you rather be right now? Would you rather be in front of your computer listening to me talk about ancient Greek and Roman philosophy? Or would you rather be on a roller coaster or at a rock concert? Or would you rather be rock climbing or going on a hike or something? Chances are you'd probably rather be doing those other things. And this makes sense, according to CYRENAIC hedonism, because this is the way nature has built us. Nature has built us to experience intense pleasure, and that is when we are happiest. Now, the second form of hedonism is referred to as Epicureanism and is also known as refined hedonism. And it was founded by the Greek philosopher Epicurus. And Epicurus argues that the good life is defined by higher pleasures as opposed to intense sensory pleasures. And a higher pleasure would be things like enjoying good food, good wine, conversation, friendships, and philosophizing. That is, for Epicurus, sensory pleasure cannot cure psychological pain, or what he calls mental agitation. So the best forms of pleasure are social and intellectual in nature. Thus, a life dedicated to philosophizing with friends is the best form of life, for it cures us of these mental agitations. And Epicurus is famous for forming a school of thought called the Garden. And the Garden was literally a small garden where he and his disciples met and philosophized. They would eat, they would drink, and they would talk philosophy. And interestingly enough, Epicurus is one of the few schools of thought that actually admitted women into the garden. So women were regarded as equals in the Epicurean school. Now, one central virtue to highlight of Epicurean philosophy is friendship. That is, for Epicurus, we as human beings are happiest when we are in the company of friends. So to have friends is the highest virtue of the Epicurean good life. Now, there is one criticism of hedonism that we should be aware of because it is highlighted by both the Cynics and the Stoics. And essentially, both Cynics and Stoics will argue that hedonism is a trap. Indeed, feelings of pleasure are temporary and are always accompanied by feelings of pain. So pleasure will always result in pain. That is, the pleasure-pain principle is cyclical according to Cynics and Stoics. So whenever you experience pleasure, it will automatically be replaced by feelings of pain, and then one will just seek pleasure again and will be caught in this pleasure-pain cycle. So for example, it is pleasurable to make friends and to have friends, but eventually one's friends will die, which will result in pain. And the result is one will go about seeking more friends and will just ride this cycle of pleasure and pain. The same thing with going on a roller coaster, like at Six Flags. Yes, it's fun to go on the roller coaster, but after 30 to 60 seconds, the ride ends. One loses that sense of pleasure and feels a sense of pain or absence of pleasure, and therefore wants to ride the roller coaster again and is caught in this cyclical trap. Thereby, Cynics and Stoics will both argue against dedicating one's life to the pursuit of pleasure, because the reality is this: life is painful, so you better find a way to deal with it. And seeking out pleasure is not the solution, but rather is only a problem. So with this in mind, let's talk about cynicism. So although this school of thought was founded by the Greek philosopher Antisthenes, perhaps the most popular Cynic philosopher would be Diogenes of Sinope. And Diogenes is famous because he is one who renounced the world and lived in an old wine barrel, essentially living the life of like a homeless person or an indigent person. Now, why did Diogenes live this life of renunciation? Because for Cynics, the good life is defined by the renunciation of conventional pleasures. And it is the life of renunciation that results in true freedom. To live a life of attachment is to be in chains. So think about it this way. Yes, you may have an apartment and a nice iPhone, a computer, a Netflix account, but all these things cost money, and money requires work, and work requires time and stress. So the more attachments that you have in this world, the more material things, the more friendships you have, the more responsibilities you have, the more stress you're going to be, and the more enslaved or enchained you will be in this life. So the solution is basically to let go of those responsibilities, let go of those material things, all of those attachments. So when one is no longer enslaved by attachments and free of social responsibilities, it is only then that one is truly happy. So now that we have some grasp of cynicism, let's talk about Stoicism. So in many respects, Stoicism can be defined as refined cynicism. Okay, why? Because the Stoics preached non-attachment to the world, like the Cynics, but they also actively engaged in the world. So interestingly, many of the Stoics were actually rulers and statesmen, like the Roman statesman Cicero and the Roman emperor Marcus Aurelius. And the Stoic philosophy can be summarized by four major teachings. Everything is determined by fate, one should approach life with disinterest, to survive, one must be courageous, and everything has a price. So in terms of the Stoic concept of fate, Stoics believe that the universe is governed by an all-powerful intelligence called the Logos, or the divine reason, or the word. Thereby, everything in life has been more or less predetermined by the Logos. As a result, human beings have very little control over their lives and what happens to them. So the best way to react to this fated existence is to be disinterested and courageous. And the Stoics developed this concept referred to as the disinterested rational will, which means to adopt an attitude of non-attachment to the world. So to live a good life, one must understand that life is impermanent and beyond our control, so loss in this life is inevitable. It's going to happen to everybody. So not only should one be disinterested, that is, just be aware that they're going to lose things, and when they lose them, just to let them go. A Stoic should also be courageous or practice mental toughness. So despite the rigors and disappointments of life, one must be courageous and continue forward. So to be disinterested and courageous, The Stoic is able to maintain mental clarity and spiritual equanimity. In other words, one can endure the pains of life with a peaceful and serene mind. So if one loses their house or their job, or they become crippled, or they have a debilitating disease, one can just be like, well, that's life. Life is full of loss and unpredictability. I just have to be courageous and maintain some mental clarity and continue forward. Now, one Stoic philosopher who really lived this kind of according to this Stoic philosophy, was Epictetus. And Epictetus realized from an early age that he had no control over his life. He was born as a slave and he was crippled as a young man when he was punished by his master. But despite this fate, Epictetus endured the pains and absurdities of life by maintaining disinterest and courage. And what Epictetus essentially realized is that what matters in life is not what happens to you, but how you react. And this is because the only thing that human beings have control over is their mindset. Human beings really have no control over what happens to them in this life. The only thing that can be controlled is how they react and how they maintain a certain state of mind. And lastly, everything has a cost. So although our lives are controlled by logos, the Stoics argue that we still have some influence over the direction of our life. And when you make life decisions, you have to be prepared to accept the cost of your actions. So for example, if someone wants to be a pop star, like the folks who are, in this picture right here, then I'm sure it's great. Some of the benefits would be you have fans, you have money, you're doing something that you really love. But there's also a cost to this life. You have very little privacy. You can't, have a normal life like anyone else. So even though they have bought into this life of a pop star, they've also had to sacrifice certain things along the way. The same thing with home ownership. If you want to own a McMansion, it means that you have to get a high-paying job, and that means lots of hours on the job and responsibilities. But if you choose to kind of live a more modest life, and let's say live in a trailer home or something, then you may not have to, get that high-paying job. You could have more time to yourself. So if you want a big home, that requires sacrifice. If you want a smaller home, that requires sacrifice as well in another way. So put simply, nothing in life is free. If you want something in life, it will cost you something. And that is just a fact of life that has to be accepted by the Stoic. So I'd like to end with a concluding question. If you had to choose one of these life philosophies, which one would you choose and why? Are you a hedonist? Are you a cynic? Or are you a Stoic? I look forward to learning your responses.